So fantastic. I just learned that I was on mute. So let's kick it off again. Hello, everyone. Super happy to be here. My name is Bomila. I'm the CEO and co-founder of Plan A. And we host these sessions, The Path to Net Zero, as LinkedIn Lives, for the last few months to discuss on a monthly basis different topics related to how we can decarbonize our economy. We have always really exciting guests, and today doesn't make an exception. I'm incredibly happy to welcome. Fantastic. I just love Aditi. Aditi is an expert in sustainability, but also in particular an expert in the food system. She has been working for the last few years in the agricultural topic, but also in many other industries, specifically looking into how to decarbonize them. And I'll be looking forward to the next few seconds for her to join, switching on her camera. Maybe a few sentences about her background actually can be shared by her. Aditi, welcome. So happy to have you here today.
Super. Thanks for having me. Can everyone hear me? Wonderful. Hi, Lou. Thanks for having me. Maybe I just kick off with telling just a few words about myself. Super. So I am Aditi. I'm based in Berlin, and I work at SYSTEMIQ. SYSTEMIQ is a think and do tank and also an advisory firm. And we focus on system change for climate action, right? We work across multiple platforms. So food and nature is one, and that's going to be our focus of the discussion today. And that's also what I work on a lot. But we also focus on materials and energy. As a company, we not only advise corporates and governments, but we also invest in early stage climate tech startups. And we have incubated a handful of companies ourselves. We also invest in research and publish cutting edge thinking and thought leadership around decarbonization. So yeah, that's a little bit about SYSTEMIQ. My background is actually with McKinsey. So I joined SYSTEMIQ about a year ago, and I was at McKinsey for several years before that. And I also invest in climate tech as an angel investor.
Amazing. Thank you so much for this context. Maybe just to kick it off with the question that I always ask to all the guests, how did you enter into the topic? Clearly, you have been working in sustainability now for a few years, but probably this was not immediately the industry and the topic that you were covering. So it'd be wonderful to understand why this became so prominent and essentially became your career as well.
Yeah, so it started off... So my journey in this topic started off at McKinsey. So at McKinsey, I was with our think tank, the McKinsey Global Institute. And the focus of my research was global health and sustainable development, right, in the emerging markets. And one of the advantages of working in a think tank is that you don't live in the present, you kind of live in the future. So, you know, you're thinking and trying to address problems that we will face a couple of decades from now. And so what I came to realize through my research is that both the topic of global health as well as sustainable development, the biggest and the most imminent risk that we're facing is the climate and nature crisis. And so I said, this is really what I want to double down on and focus on. And what I did was I took some time off to really think about what I want to do and where I want to spend my time, what problem I want to spend my time on. And I came across Terra. And for people who have not heard of Terra, Terra.do, Terra is a startup based in the US with the mission of getting 100 million people to work in the climate space over the next years. And I did a wonderful course there. So I learned about, the climate problem, the nature problem, everything from climate science to the solutions across the different systems. And that really kind of helped me figure out what I want to work on. And that's where I am. And more recently, I've actually invested in Terra as an angel. And I would encourage everyone who's interested in learning more and working on this topic to really look them up and do a learning session.
A little ad plug-in for your fast investment in climate tech. Fantastic.
Yes.
This is really exciting to learn about, and I think it's really also a good demonstration of how it really doesn't matter what you've been doing before. If you have a passion for solving this big problem, then probably you can find a way in. We have the topic of food today. Maybe just to frame the conversation in a way that people that are not necessarily familiar with it would be helpful, maybe to hear your thoughts on why do we need to even decarbonize the food systems, and then we can dive into how.
Yeah, sure. So the food system has worked, on the surface has been working pretty well for us, right? So as the global population has been growing, we, to a greater and lesser extent, we have access to affordable, safe food. But when you look under the surface, there are many, many hidden costs in the food system. Everything from health, right, human health, obesity, etc., to climate and nature. And I am standing on the shoulders of giants. So at SYSTEMIQ, we have spent several years doing research on the food system, and we've been the founding member of the FOLU coalition, the Food and Land Use Coalition. And one of the pieces of research that we did that was published a couple of years ago, and happy to put the link at the end of this to that report. What we found was that there are many hidden costs in the food system, right? There are many things that aren't working well. And in fact, if you put a dollar number value to it, right, there are about $12 trillion of hidden costs in the current food system, which is actually more than the value of the entire sector, right? And this is pretty shocking. So kind of even beyond just the climate and nature issue, there are many issues with the food system, and we really need to think about it. But of course, here our topic is about decarbonization and climate specifically. So if we look at that, right, the food system from end to end is responsible for about 30% of global emissions. And this is in fact more than, the energy system. And the trajectory isn't, we're not seeing it peaking. We're not seeing it's just going to increase because at current population rates, we need to increase our food production by about 50% in the next couple of decades, right? So the challenge is immense, but at the same time, the opportunity is also immense. So that's why I'm really interested in the system, and kind of that's the framing that I would give for the challenge at hand.
Mm-hmm. It's really fantastic that you give us also an overview of kind of where the systemic issue within food is. There's a lot of statistics that show that we're losing 40% of the produce that we have worldwide. There's also a lot of inefficiencies related to supply chains that were exposed during COVID, but also now related to the war in Ukraine. When companies come to you and they ask, what can we do? Clearly, the size of the issue is so undigestible. Where do you start? Like, what is your first step whenever you work with a company, and what usually comes out of this first step?
Yeah, I mean, there are different ways in approaching this problem, right? So we've talked to our clients about looking at the entire portfolio, so rethinking their portfolio to fit within planetary boundaries, and at the same time, be positive towards human health, right? So very often food companies, that's one of the topics that they want to discuss. Another big emerging area is really the topic of decarbonization and how to get to net zero, right? Food companies are almost, I would say, at the forefront of setting SBTI targets. So many have even set very ambitious SBTI targets to reach net zero by 2040. There, of course, the big question they're asking is, how do we do it, right? So what does our roadmap to net zero look like? How expensive is it going to be? How are we going to implement this, within our company? So those are, I would say, broadly kind of the two questions they're asking. But beyond that, I think what I wanted to say is, at Systemic, we look at the system as a whole, right? So um, uh, I called out FOLU, but we also work, we have different roundtables where we bring, companies together with policymakers, etc. And there it's really about thinking about a systemic solution to the problem, be it for specific commodities like palm oil or coffee, or at a more broad level across the entire food sector.
So we're going to get a little bit more technical because I know how much you love that. And also I know how much the work of SYSTEMIQ in particular is diving into these scientifically kind of driven evidences on how we can go about on solving a problem. So maybe it would be useful, first of all, to explain some concepts. Can you explain what is farm to fork analysis?
Yeah, that's like the end-to-end analysis, right? So if you think about the value chain, you start with where the food is being produced at the farmer level, and then a lot of steps happen until it gets to your plate, which is the fork. So there's a lot of logistics, there's production and processing, there is retail, and then it comes to you. So that's why it's called kind of farm to fork, which is this entire value chain end to end.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so the land, the food processing, distribution, consumption. So all of this is responsible for 30% of global energy consumption and roughly 27% of global GHG emissions. You also mentioned that number. Essentially, to put it like bluntly, food is responsible for over a quarter of the total world emissions. In your opinion, and from the work that you've been doing with SYSTEMIQ, what are policymakers, I guess, also scientists, but also businesses doing to transform the food systems? It is quite evident from what you just said that it really requires for us to have a collaborative approach in order to be able to address these big issues. But what are you seeing maybe in particular as steps for the transformation by the individual stakeholders, and also maybe some of the examples of the other collaboration activities that you have?
Yeah, I would say, unfortunately, not enough is being done. The scale of the problem is immense and the urgency is clear. But the good news is, I mean, we know what needs to be done, right? So again, to kind of go back to the report that we wrote, we identified like 10 critical transitions that need to take place for a food system that works for people, for nature, and for climate, right? Let me point out a few. One is around promoting healthy diets. And there it's kind of clear what needs to be done, right? More plant-based, less sugar, less meat, etc. Then we need to scale nature-based solutions, right, within agriculture. So agriculture needs to work along with nature and not against nature. And that's everything from scaling regenerative agriculture practices, restoring nature on land, like through forests, so converting agricultural land back to forests, or integrating forests into agriculture, and finally also creating a more productive kind of ocean system, right? Because that's an important protein source as well. And then we also need to reduce food loss and waste. You mentioned what a big challenge that is. And we need to diversify protein supply. So these are just a handful of kind of critical transitions that we've identified. And so the challenge is immense. The answers are available, but moving the system towards this is not going to be easy. But let me call out a few kind of pockets of success, right? So if you look at New Zealand, what they are doing in collaboration with the farmers, right? They're putting some kind of a carbon price or a carbon tax on agriculture. And they're also pricing or valuing the carbon that is sequestered. So what this means is that over the next few decades, automatically there will be less emissions from their agricultural sector, and more of their agricultural land will be converted into forests again, because they're valuing forests and the carbon sequestered in a positive way. That's one example. And New Zealand is interesting because more than half their emissions of the country actually comes from agriculture. They're so heavily reliant on it. I think scientists are also doing their part, right? So just as an example, there was a huge report published a few years ago called the Eat Lancet Commission, where they looked at, what kind of diets do we need that work for the planet and for people, for human health. And there, of course, the good news is that, there is a pretty big overlap, right? So I think scientists are also doing their part. I think businesses and consumers are also kind of doing their part. So if you look at a few trends around alternative dairy, I heard recently that in the US, more than 16-17% of milk today is alternative dairy, right? So the soy, the oat, etc. Even with meat, we're seeing many new brands and companies entering the market in alternative meat. That's not happening fast enough, but there is a lot of innovation there as well. So I would say there are many things to be hopeful about, but we need this to happen at scale.
Yeah, absolutely. And what really is clear from what you're saying is that there is enough innovation out there. It's just that it's not maybe implemented at scale. I remember speaking a few months ago to the ambassador of Costa Rica to the European Commission, and he was saying that the way they transformed their economy, and obviously one that is heavily reliant on agriculture, was actually through education of the farmers. So 15 years ago, they sat them down and they explained to them how if they don't take care of the land, if they start investing heavily and continue investing heavily in monocultures, actually this will lead to a lot of land effectiveness loss. So for this reason, they started teaching them how to do regenerative agriculture, which is one that is another one of those exciting solutions that we can tap into if we think of what has been effective way to work together with nature, which is, what you said earlier with the nature-based solutions. I want to ask you about land, because I think one element of being in cooperation with businesses, but also you mentioned policymakers, is that you have been able to identify one of the key challenges that we have is that the fact that the food system is the largest user of land on this planet. I believe in the US it was 15% of the whole country, or even 25. In the future, we will need to feed more people with less viable land as we continue to degrade soil. For those of the people listening that maybe don't know, actually monocultures are causing to loss of habitat, which leads to loss of biodiversity, and then essentially an ecosystem collapse potentially. So that means that not every land will be fertile due to temperature increase. It gets even worse in some places, and the land is also deserted. How do we go about actually making out of less land, more, and then also what kind of solutions have you seen work for your clients, or maybe through the partnerships that you have?
Yeah, I mean, here the answer is relatively simple, right? So some commodities disproportionately use land, water, and other resources. What I'm talking about is specifically beef, both meat and dairy, but mostly just the meat and beef and lamb, right? So just to give you some stats, you need 20 times the amount of land for 1 calorie of beef as one compared to 1 calorie of plant-based protein like legumes. So the impact is just disproportionate. So here, I mean, the clearly what needs to be done is we just need to, especially in the global north, right? We just need to consume less beef and dairy. And if we did that, right, especially in the global north, you could halve the amount of land in hectares that is used for agriculture. So essentially something like 2 billion hectares of land would be set free if we all stopped consuming beef. Of course, that's not going to happen, and it's definitely not going to happen overnight. But it's just to show that, you know, the answer in this case is very clear, that it's not that we need to change habits across the board. It doesn't mean that everyone has to turn vegetarian overnight, but it's about beef, dairy, and lamb consumption that needs to decrease.
Really interesting. And do you feel like there's resonance with these messages and these statistics in businesses? Are you seeing that companies come to you and they're, okay, we know that our industry has so much responsibility. Help us figure out like how we go about this.
Yeah, yes. So we're talking to.
I bet those that are converted come to you.
Exactly. Let's say those who aren't only focused on meat. Well, yeah. So those that are more diversified, I think they understand the issue and they understand kind of the scale of the issue. And they see the need to change. There is no doubt about it. But like in every industry, there are many vested interests, and the change is going to happen at a very, very slow rate. But these messages are relatively, well known, at least on the production side. Yeah.
It always makes me hopeful whenever we sit down with a business to walk them through the cost loss associated to actually all these inefficiencies. And I'm sure that in the food sector, this is a really viable evidence of why they should do something, because obviously if you're losing 40% of the produce, maybe not in every single food sector, still probably this is a convincing factor to them. Which kind of maybe is a natural way to go to the next question about food waste. As we said in the beginning, you mentioned, I also repeated it, we have a third, of the food grown, produced, and processed being wasted. In a way, this is an absolutely unacceptable loss of resources, of nutrients, at a time when we have clearly a growing demand for food because of more people having to be fed, but also because of the instability of the supply chains that we have at the moment. What innovations have you seen or have you implemented in some of your plans to tackle this issue of food waste?
Yeah, so food waste is, I mean, it's just shocking, right? So something like 8% of greenhouse gases that are emitted every year, it's because of food waste. So this is more than like the aviation sector, right? It's more than the shipping sector put together, right? So these numbers are pretty shocking. And so like there is no doubt that we need to innovate from the private sector side, but we also need policies in place to reduce food waste. And the thing is, the reasons behind at what point of the value chain food is being wasted is pretty complex. So in the global north, like in Europe and the US, it's mostly happening at the consumer end, right? At that end, at like downstream. Whereas in emerging markets where the supply chains are weak, right? It's happening more at the farm level and the distribution level. So even before it gets to the consumer, um, you know, like vegetables rot or the grains aren't stored properly. So there you have that issue. Um, in terms of innovations, I'm not an expert in this space, but like there are a few interesting things that we are seeing. Some of the companies that we're talking to are want to adopt. So one example is Appeal. This is a startup from the US. They put like a very thin layer of edible coating on fruits and maybe even vegetables, but mostly just fruits like avocados and citrus fruits. And this makes the shelf life increase 2 to 3 times. All right. So that's
Wow.
one. Then, because in the global north, the food waste is happening much more at the consumer level. The question here is really, something like Too Good to Go is a great example, right? Where shops, before they close down, they give things at a much bigger discount and people rather than throwing it off. But then there are also examples from countries that have adopted policies that have been successful at reducing food waste. So in France, there was a law a couple of years ago that retailers can't just send the expired stuff into landfill or into waste streams. That was one example. China and the UK have also put many other policies in place. But yeah, it's still a massive problem that we need to go after. And I
Yeah.
think we go after it at different parts of the value chain.
Yeah, absolutely. Just to name a few other examples, I guess Olio is another UK company. I recently had the chance to meet finally in person Tessa, who's the CEO and co-founder, and they work in a similar model as Too Good to Go, but just have a bit of a different approach where they take food from restaurants as well. And obviously, I don't know if you saw, it was quite of a funny campaign that now has come out that is all these like vegetables that don't have the particularly
Yeah.
famous shape of the vegetables that we buy in the supermarket or in a farmer's market to essentially be now called like sexy. So essentially there's been quite a lot of noise that was made in the UK and France and I think across Europe just because of this being on an even European Union level quite a significant topic. I guess I just checked actually. We have across the different channels that we are on more than 300 people watching live.
Oh,
And
wow.
it's really exciting. And I think this topic actually is one that has been attracting a lot of attention. Because at the end of the day, we're all consumers of food. Maybe you don't necessarily see the direct connection of decarbonizing the cement industry that alongside other construction materials is 15% of emissions on this planet, but food is so deeply embedded into the existence of every one of us. So kind of maybe looking into this element of food being not only an industry but also something that all of us personally have such a strong connection with. How and you can maybe walk us through examples from the client perspective that you have, or maybe just like from an individual perspective. What does it really matter if people become vegan, vegetarian? You did mention the statistics about beef, which are quite significant, about emissions associated to, or land use associated to 1 calorie. What parts of the system considered important to think about when people speak or kind of decide for themselves to become vegan, vegetarian? Are consumer habits actually something that really matters?
For sure, there's no doubt about it. And I think I think it's easy for me to say I've been vegetarian all my life. I'm trying to be vegan as much as I can. Find it difficult, but it's still an aspiration. And I think, like, from an individual point of view, right? I know how hard it is for people to change habits. But it can have it can make a massive difference, even if it's just individuals kind of changing, and people don't have to go vegetarian fully overnight, right? It's just about reducing consumption of animal-based protein, and specifically just beef and lamb, and dairy, of course, as well. But it's it, there's one campaign that I really like called Meat Once a Week. So it's not about becoming vegetarian fully, but like just be mindful and reduce your consumption to make it just once a week. I thought that was a pretty cool campaign, and I have to say at this point that my daughter, she was eating meat the first few years in her life, and then kind of learned more and more from my, let's say, brainwashing of why she shouldn't. And she tried to take this campaign of meat once a week to her school. And she wrote to her principal, and ultimately they now have meat in the cafeteria, something just like twice a week, right?
Wow.
So, you can make, and this can be a pretty big and significant change, right? If you do it at an individual, then at a organizational level. Yeah.
Amazing, yeah. Such a wonderful example also of how small steps then on an individual level can impact a lot of people at the same time.
Yeah.
We have another set of questions that we've prepared, but there's so many questions that are in the chat as well.
Yeah, I can see that.
Which is really exciting. Maybe shifting a little bit gear, because I do feel like it is our responsibility, given your background, to speak also about this business transformation that has to happen within this industry. What are the usual first steps that you see a business taking that is coming from the food sector? And what would you recommend has to happen when a business is, at least with the mindset to become net zero or to start decarbonizing?
I mean, we often come into the discussion with companies where the top management has already decided this is the way to go, right? So the first, I would say, the most important step is like top management buy-in, because this is not going to happen kind of bottom up, right? And for many companies, it also means a pretty significant change in strategy and a shift in strategy. So that buy-in has to be there. And so, like, clearly stating that kind of this is the type of company we want to be in the future, and we want to and committing to, let's say, SBTi targets by 2050 or 2040. That's kind of really the first step. Then very often, of course, this exactly what you're doing, right, with Plan A, giving them an overview of where their big emission hotspots are, right? And then so you can help them then to start thinking about how they reduce those and create like a roadmap over the next 2-3 decades to get to net zero. So that's kind of very much how the questions that our corporate clients are really posing to us today.
Yeah, thank you so much. And I think for those that are listening, regardless of their size, small or big food companies, there's clearly a path to take, like even small steps to get going. It doesn't need to be that you really figure it out on day one. I'm sure you can tell us a lot of stories where companies are incredibly advanced. And I would like to maybe move to one big player within the food industry, and this is the supermarkets. Do you think supermarkets are in a unique position to be a driving force for this sustainability transformation? And how do they play a part?
Yeah, for sure. I think supermarkets definitely play a very important role because they are kind of, the first in line between customers and kind of the food, let's say, sector, kind of the food value chain behind them. And there are pretty cool and interesting examples of how supermarkets are nudging their customers to change behavior, right? So for instance, there are supermarkets that are working with pricing and reducing the prices of plant-based alternatives, which are today typically still, not at price parity compared to regular meat. There's another very interesting anecdote that I heard from my neighbor who comes from Denmark. So when you're in co-op in Copenhagen, or at least in that one store that she explained to me, when you're at the aisle to buy meat, and you have two options, you have like organic pork, and you have kind of factory farm or industrial farmed pork. What they did was on the floor they made a little drawing of how much space a pig has to live,
Oh
right?
my God.
For the organic option and for the farmed option or the factory farm option. And apparently that was like a total eye opener and really made people switch to the purchase of organic meat. I thought that
Wow.
was a really interesting example. But yes, just to show you that I think there are many supermarkets around the world that are using interesting kind of nudging techniques.
Wow, this is such an interesting example, and I think it really makes a big difference when people become a lot more educated about the process that a food has gone through, and before it comes um, to their table. Because at the end of the day, probably many of us cannot even consider. I remember speaking to someone and telling them about the difference between an avocado from Spain and avocado from Mexico, and just the amount of emissions, and what does this mean if this was actually the production of another type of food. And they figured out that with the emissions that were created for the avocado in Mexico, they could have had a dinner for the whole family in terms of emission levels versus the one in Spain. And that's not an anecdote that is specific to a particular company. It's just that there's transportation associated, there's water, and so on. Well, you mentioned organic. You mentioned also the farmed cattle. I guess cattle. I guess there's a lot of alternatives out there, and we've been here and there mentioning them. So maybe to set the scene, there's cultured meat, there's lab-grown meat, there's plant-based alternatives. What are you seeing is kind of driving mainly the agenda of the food sector? What are they opting for? Because obviously all of these different options are at a different stage of innovation, but also maybe the adoption on the consumer side is not the same.
Yeah, I mean, cultured meat is still not there in the market, right? And there may be many people who are skeptical about, you know, something that is grown in a lab by humans to consume that. But what I often wonder is, I like what we put up with today, the conditions and factory farms, right? Those are, equally kind of unthinkable for me to, I don't see how people accept that versus something that is grown in a lab. So there are questions on how this is going to evolve, and what openness consumers, how open consumers are towards some of these products. I'm not an expert on all the different types of alternative meats. I think what I would say is, like, the jury's still out on when exactly cultured meat will reach price parity, because many people think that this is like 2 or 3 decades out. There are some who think that it'll happen much earlier. I think what is going to be interesting is a hybrid form, right? So there are people who recently told me about some products that are coming into the market in Singapore, and maybe even China, right? Of chicken, which is mostly like 90% plant-based, but has a few cells of cultured meat kind of on it to give it the extra taste, right? So this hybrid might be the winner versus plant-based or cultured meat. But I think the jury is still out, and we'll see kind of where this goes.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's just been so much innovation in this space. I've been eating
Yeah.
lately a lot of alternatives to fish. So all of these like chickpea based, and there's just so much going on. I'm excited for seeing where we get to when it comes to meat, because obviously this is quite of a crucial element of decarbonizing the food industry. Final question on my side, and then we'll jump to the questions of the audience, which are now endless. And I want to apologize in advance that we're not going to be able to cover them all. Um, from the work that you've been doing with businesses and also with policymakers, what are the incentives that, besides saving humanity, I guess, or like addressing climate change, for those that really understand that we have this big issue ahead of us, that get to be noted or mentioned when it comes to transforming the food sector?
Yeah, I think in this sector there is a case to be made that you multi-solve, right? So for policymakers, things like human health is going to be very important. So, like I mentioned before, there is a pretty big overlap between, for when it comes to diets that are both planet friendly and human health friendly. So that's good news. I think it's good news for national security and food security. I think it is good to, just many of the many of the points I made around regenerative agricultural practices and stuff like that, right? All that leads to healthy soils, which then lead to more resilient, let's say, food systems. And so you have reduced food security. I think also to animal welfare. I mean, honestly, I think this is going to be one of these topics where our grandkids will, come to us and say, how the hell could you have done this? Just like we think about, many topics like slavery, etc. So I think at a kind of at the policy level, I think those at a company level, I think it's really interesting because companies that transition their farms or their suppliers to regenerative agriculture, they actually also see benefits in their supply chains, right? So their supply chains become more resilient. If you're a first mover, in some cases, yes, you might have, additional costs. But if you move and try to secure, you know, commodity supplies for regeneratively, produced commodities like coffee and cocoa, which are commodities that we have a lot of experience in and we're working with as well. What you can do is you can like secure these supplies today at a lower cost than in 10 years from now, where when almost every company will be buying for it, right? So that's why there are some first mover advantages here as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So now we're going to move to the questions from the audience. There's just so many of them, so I'm getting a bit overwhelmed. I did find one that I thought it was really interesting. It was about genetically modified food, and I think we have not covered this in a lot of detail, but as we know, a lot of our food is actually genetically modified in one way or another. In certain geographies, certainly more than in others. But what do you think is the role that a GMO plays on a sustainable agricultural system? Because now GMO is so deeply embedded in the way we produce food. Is there any potential for better carbon sequestration? Thank you to Gelson for this wonderful question.
Yeah, no, I must say I'm not an expert here, so I don't want to, say something that is false. But just because you asked, Gelson, the role that GMOs play in carbon sequestration, there's a really interesting company in the US, and I'll look it up. The name's just failing me right now. But what they have done is they have created genetically modified trees, right? So this is not food system, but the nature system that are capable of sequestering more carbon than the average, and then also create higher quality timber. So I thought that was a really interesting example of linking GMO to carbon sequestration potential.
I think it's the general logic, I guess, of GMO, where through the work that we've done to work with science, I guess, on making things more effective, there's benefits to it. But ultimately, as you also mentioned in different ways, throughout the discussion that we had, the most important bit is really that we start respecting nature a lot more and work with nature, which is where agroforestry, regenerative agriculture really helps quite a lot. I think the question that I found quite interesting was about farms in cities. Maybe you don't necessarily have all the experience of how this could work, but maybe you've seen it in some of your clients or with some of the governments that you have been working with, farms essentially being brought to cities.
Yeah, in fact, I'm sitting in a co-working space in Berlin, and we have these wonderful in-farm, farms, so glass houses, and they're so cool because every day I come in and I see it's blossomed a little more. I think this is a great solution for leafy greens, but I'm yet to see at scale affordable production of, let's say, vegetables to a bigger extent. And the other issue is, I think, like, for sure, this, you reduce transportation emissions, you reduce food loss and waste. So there are many advantages of producing locally and in cities. But on the other hand, they also have a pretty high energy footprint, right? So especially in countries where the energy sources are not very renewable, this might not be the ideal solution if you look at the entire life cycle. Yeah.
Amazing. Thank you so much. And I think it does make sense to mention that there's actual reasons why food is being produced in one place versus another. Netherlands, being one of the smallest countries in Europe in terms of size, actually is the biggest exporter of food on so many different types of food, because they've been able to make the most of the land through vertical farming and so on. So there's also elements of efficiency that need to be considered. But of course, less consumption as well, and better education of consumers about how to consume in a better way. There's a big question that I would like to take, is the one before the last, and it is, because of your experience of working with actually big companies like this, So how do you decarbonize entire food supply chains? I think the examples that are given here are where you have like so many different products and so many different suppliers. How do you even start? Like you mentioned some target setting, but what happens after that?
Yeah, this is such a great question. And it's really the billion-dollar question at the moment, right? And many of these companies that you've mentioned, Unilever, Nestle, they've set pretty massive targets, very, very ambitious targets. And I really hope that they, meet them because we're in trouble if they don't. And I see that they're all working towards it, right? So if you look at the plans of these companies, the roadmaps that they've brought out, they're pretty detailed, right? And there are a range of ideas and a range of levers that they can pull. Let me mention a couple. So one is definitely thinking about shifting your product portfolio, right? So how do you shift towards, and this can be organic or even inorganic growth through M&A, how do you go towards more plant-based? How do you start replacing the ingredients of, your specific, let's say, I don't know, ice cream or what have you, right? So that's one big topic. Then the second big topic is about sourcing sustainably, right? So how do you source not conventional monoculture coffee, but how do you source agroforestry coffee? Because agroforestry coffee is actually carbon negative. So it's a sink for carbon and it's not a source of carbon, right? Like conventional monoculture agriculture is. And this is of course not just for these tropical commodities, but also for your regular commodities like wheat, right? So how do you get your farmers to start shifting and taking up regenerative agricultural practices so that the footprint of the commodities that you are sourcing is lower, or in some cases also negative? So that's the second big bucket around sourcing ingredients sustainably. Then there's a lot that they are doing around operations, and this is everything from renewable energy, renewable thermal energy, moving towards kind of green logistics, right? So using less plastic in their for their products. So that's kind of the third big bucket. Yeah, so if I were to kind of frame their strategies, I would say these are the three big categories of levers that they have. And then, of course, they all have to go through very systematically, kind of product line by product line, and see what can be done.
Amazing. This is a really utter response to this question, and I hope it gives inspiration for those listening that are not familiar. We're coming to the end of our session, and again, as always, we finish off with action suggestions. So, if you consider a food business that maybe is on their path for becoming sustainable, they've now had quite a lot of tips. What would you suggest they do, and that is applicable to any company at any stage of their sustainability journey within the food sector? Is it about the collaboration? Is it about also involving employees or suppliers? If there's any one unifying kind of idea that can be left in the minds of anyone that is within this industry.
For me, it all starts at the top. So, aligning the top leadership around this goal is, I think, the first step towards changing, because what this means for many food companies is a very, very fundamental kind of strategic shift. So if I could kind of wave my magic wand, I would say that's that's the first thing we need to do, kind of get the top leadership to transition their
Amazing.
mindset.
Aditi, as always, incredible pleasure to be able to share a moment with you and also to learn from you. I think it's incredibly important to cover this topic, and I really appreciate that you gave us 1 hour of your time to discuss why this matters.
Thank you so much. I had so much fun, Lou. Thank you for inviting me. Thank you for pulling this together. And I have to also say thank you to the audience for such amazing and thoughtful comments. I'm going to go through each and every one of them, and I'll leave some comments as well on some of the reports and companies that I mentioned. So
Thank you
thank you
so
so
much.
much.
So thank you all for being able to join us today. I think it was yet again another fantastic discussion. Next one is really exciting, and I would highly recommend that you click on the link that is in the comments that will be added in a second. We're going to be talking about energy storage. So as many of you, we have a lot of energy consumption increase, and we're going to be seeing even more so in the coming decades. This means that we need to power our planet, power our economy, but how do we do this in a sustainable manner? I'm going to be talking to an incredibly good friend of mine, also someone I admire for the work that they're doing about how do we do that. So check out the link, and thank you again for being here. Have a wonderful